Everyone thought Johnny Depp would quietly return to acting and rebuild what he lost. But 2026 just flipped that entire narrative. Instead of chasing film roles, he's diving deep into something no one expected, a passion so rare that elite collectors are literally competing behind closed doors to get a piece of it. This isn't a hobby, it's a high-stakes world where art, identity, and legacy collide. And the most shocking part, there's actual proof from recent public appearances and verified statements that this shift is completely real. The question is, why now, and what is he really building behind the scenes? For years people assumed Johnny Depp would eventually return to the spotlight the same way he always had, stepping back into major roles, reclaiming the big screen, and proving that his legacy in Hollywood was untouchable. But something shifted quietly, almost invisibly, and if you weren't paying attention, you completely missed it. This wasn't a loud announcement. There was no massive press tour, no dramatic reveal. Instead, it started through subtle appearances, rare interviews, and carefully chosen moments where he hinted at a completely different direction. Not acting, not producing, not even directing. Something far more personal, and honestly, far more valuable in a way most people don't immediately understand. The first real sign came when he began showing up in environments that had nothing to do with film sets. Private galleries, exclusive art events, and invite-only exhibitions where cameras are limited and conversations matter more than publicity. People noticed that he wasn't there as a celebrity guest trying to stay relevant. He was there as someone deeply involved, asking questions, discussing techniques, and even presenting pieces of his own work. And this is where things started to get interesting because insiders began confirming that this wasn't just casual interest. It was obsession. According to multiple verified reports and public statements, including coverage from outlets like BBC News and The Guardian, Depp had already been quietly building a serious presence in the art world. His collaborations with established galleries weren't random. They were strategic. Limited edition collections tied to his artwork began selling out almost instantly, sometimes within hours. And we're not talking about small numbers here. We're talking about pieces that reached high six figures in total sales, driven not just by fans, but by serious collectors who understood the rarity behind what he was doing. What makes this even more fascinating is that his approach doesn't follow the typical celebrity pattern. Most celebrities enter art as a side project, something to enhance their brand. But Depp has been approaching it like a craftsman. In interviews and documented appearances, he's referenced his influences, his creative process, and even the emotional weight behind certain pieces. This is someone who isn't trying to impress the public. He's trying to express something deeper, and that authenticity is exactly what's pulling collectors in. And here's where the tension starts building. Because while the public still sees him as Jack Sparrow or the eccentric actor from iconic films, a completely different reputation is forming behind closed doors. Collectors are beginning to see him as a serious artist with limited output. And in the art world, limited output combined with global recognition creates something incredibly powerful. Scarcity. There have been verified sales through major galleries such as Castle Fine Art, where his collections didn't just perform well, they exceeded expectations to a level that shocked even experienced dealers. Reports confirmed that some releases sold out within hours, generating millions in revenue. And while headlines focused on the numbers, insiders were paying attention to something else entirely. The speed of those sales. That kind of demand doesn't happen unless there's genuine belief in long-term value. And that's where wealthy collectors start to behave differently. They don't just buy art because they like it. They buy it because they see what it could become. And in this case, they're looking at a globally recognized figure who has stepped away from acting at a critical point in his career and redirected his energy into something far more controlled and exclusive. That creates a narrative. And in the art world, narrative is everything. But here's the part most people don't realize. This shift didn't happen overnight. Depp has always had a connection to art, long before this became public. Sketches, paintings, and creative experimentation were part of his private life for years. What changed in 2026 wasn't the passion itself. It was the decision to make it visible, to step into that world fully and allow it to define his next chapter. In a recent documented appearance that circulated through verified media coverage, he spoke about creativity in a way that clearly separated this new path from his acting career. He described it as something more personal, something that didn't require permission from studios or scripts, something that allowed complete control, and that one idea alone explains everything. Control. After years of legal battles, public scrutiny, and industry uncertainty, stepping into a world where he controls the output, the release, and the narrative isn't just a career move. It's a strategic repositioning. And collectors understand strategy better than anyone. Because when a figure like Johnny Depp limits access to their work, avoids oversaturation, and builds demand through exclusivity, the value doesn't just hold. It grows. And quietly, without mainstream attention catching up yet, that growth has already started. Private conversations among collectors have reportedly shifted from curiosity to urgency. Early buyers are already being seen as ahead of the curve. And when that mindset spreads, it creates something powerful. Competition. And competition in high-end collecting doesn't look like what most people imagine. It's not loud. It's silent, calculated, and often happens in rooms the public never sees. Offers made privately, pieces traded discreetly, values discussed without ever being publicly listed. And the more limited the supply, the more intense the competition becomes. Right now, Depp is sitting in a position that very few celebrities have ever managed to reach. He's transitioning from mass entertainment into controlled scarcity. And the difference between those two worlds is massive. One depends on constant visibility. The other thrives on selective presence. And that's exactly what makes this moment so important. Because while most people are still asking if he'll return to acting, the real story is unfolding somewhere else entirely. A space where recognition meets rarity, where identity shifts from performer to creator, and where every new release isn't just content, it's an asset. And the collectors who are paying attention right now, they're not waiting to see what happens next. They're already moving before the rest of the world even realizes what's happening. And the reason they're moving early isn't based on hype, it's based on patterns they've seen before. In the high-end art world, there's a very specific moment when a creator crosses from curiosity into credibility, and once that line is crossed, prices don't gradually increase. They shift fast. What's happening around Johnny Depp right now mirrors that exact transition point, and insiders are quietly treating it as a signal. Collectors who were initially skeptical started changing their stance after seeing the structure behind his releases. This wasn't random artwork being dropped online. This was carefully curated, limited edition series tied to specific themes, each piece carrying a narrative connected to his personal experiences and artistic influences. And that structure matters more than people think because it shows intention. In the art market, intention separates a temporary trend from something that can hold long-term value. When his collections were released through Castle Fine Art, the response wasn't just fast, it was calculated. Buyers weren't hesitating, they were preparing. Many of them already understood that the combination of global fame and controlled artistic output creates a unique window of opportunity. Once that window closes, entry becomes significantly more expensive. Verified coverage from Reuters and BBC News highlighted not just the financial success of these releases, but the behaviors surrounding them. Waiting lists formed before official launches, collectors requested private previews, and in some cases, pieces were reserved before they were even publicly announced. That level of anticipation doesn't happen unless there's confidence in future demand. But what truly accelerated the momentum was the shift in perception. At first, people saw his artwork as an extension of his celebrity status. Something fans would buy because of who he is. But the narrative started to break down as more serious buyers entered the space. Art critics, gallery insiders, and experienced collectors began analyzing the work itself. Technique, style, emotional depth, and consistency. And while opinions varied, one thing became clear. This wasn't being dismissed. In fact, in certain circles, the conversation flipped entirely. Instead of asking whether his art was valuable because of his fame, people began asking whether his fame was now amplifying an already valuable artistic identity. And that's a completely different discussion. Because when the art stands on its own, the celebrity factor becomes an accelerant, not a crutch. There were also documented instances where Depp spoke openly about his creative influences, referencing artists and experiences that shaped his approach. Those moments were subtle, but important. They showed that he wasn't entering this space blindly. He understood the history, the expectations, and the responsibility that comes with being taken seriously in that world. And that awareness is exactly what reassures high-level collectors. Another factor that's quietly driving this surge is scarcity through selectivity. Unlike actors who maintain constant visibility, Depp's appearances in the art scene have been controlled and intentional. He isn't flooding the market with endless releases. He isn't overexposing himself through constant media presence. Instead, he's doing the opposite. And that restraint is increasing demand. Because when access is limited, attention increases. When attention increases, perceived value follows. And when perceived value aligns with actual demand, prices begin to move in a way that feels almost inevitable. There are already early signs of this shift happening behind the scenes. While public resale data remains limited, private transactions are starting to reflect growing interest. Pieces acquired during initial releases are being discussed in terms of future positioning rather than immediate resale. Collectors aren't looking to flip quickly. They're holding. And in the art world, holding is a signal of belief. It's also important to understand that this isn't happening in isolation. The broader market has been leaning more aggressively into unique, story-driven art. Collectors are no longer just buying visuals. They're buying narrative, identity, and emotional connection. And few figures bring as much layered narrative as Johnny Depp. His career, his public struggles, his reinvention, all of it feeds into the meaning behind the work. And when the meaning is captured in limited physical pieces, it transforms those pieces into something more than just art. It turns them into cultural artifacts. And this is where the intensity starts to build. Because once collectors begin viewing something as a cultural artifact rather than a decorative piece, the rules change. Price becomes secondary to ownership. Rarity becomes more important than cost. And access becomes the ultimate currency. There have been quiet reports of private buyers attempting to secure multiple pieces from the same series, not for display, but for consolidation. Controlling supply is a known strategy among elite collectors. If fewer pieces circulate, perceived rarity increases. And if perceived rarity increases, long-term value strengthens. This kind of behavior doesn't show up in headlines. It happens quietly, strategically, and often long before the general public understands what's happening. And by the time it becomes obvious, the early phase is already over. Another interesting development is the crossover attention from investors who don't traditionally operate in the art space. Individuals who typically focus on luxury assets, rare collectibles, and alternative investments are beginning to pay attention. Because what they're seeing isn't just art. It's a brand evolution combined with controlled scarcity and global recognition. That combination is rare, and when it appears, it tends to create significant financial movement. And yet, despite all of this activity, the public narrative hasn't fully caught up. Most people still associate Depp with his film career. They're still waiting for a cinematic comeback. But the reality is unfolding in a completely different direction. This isn't about returning to what he was. It's about building something new that operates under entirely different rules. Rules where he sets the pace, controls the output, and defines the value. And the most fascinating part is that this transformation is happening in real time, without a dramatic announcement, without a forced rebrand, and without the usual noise that surrounds celebrity transitions. It's subtle, but it's powerful. And the people who recognize it early are positioning themselves accordingly. Because in a space where scarcity meets story, and where identity evolves into something tangible, timing becomes everything. And right now, timing is exactly what's driving the quiet urgency behind everything unfolding around him. And that urgency is starting to create a ripple effect that goes far beyond a single artist or a single collection. Because what's happening around Johnny Depp is beginning to influence how collectors think about celebrity involvement in the art world as a whole. For years, the pattern was predictable. A well-known name enters the space, releases a few pieces, gains temporary attention, and then fades out when the novelty disappears. But this situation isn't following the pattern, and that's exactly why it's becoming so disruptive. What's different here is the level of commitment and the consistency of direction. Depp isn't treating this like a side chapter running alongside acting. He's treating it like a primary identity shift. And that shift is being reinforced through his actions, not just his words. Fewer appearances tied to film, more presence in creative environments, more focus on production rather than promotion. These are signals that serious buyers track closely because actions reveal intent far more clearly than any public statement ever could. There have been multiple documented moments, referenced in verified media coverage, where he's spoken about the importance of creating without restriction. In one widely circulated interview highlighted by The Guardian, he discussed how personal expression through art allowed him to explore emotions and ideas that didn't fit within scripted roles. That kind of statement might sound simple on the surface, but in the context of a career pivot, it carries weight. It tells collectors that this isn't temporary. It's foundational. And once that perception locks in, behavior changes rapidly. Collectors who might have hesitated before start accelerating their decisions. Galleries begin positioning future releases more strategically. And even critics start paying closer attention, not to judge whether it belongs, but to understand how far it could go. Another layer that's adding to this momentum is the storytelling embedded within the artwork itself. Many of his pieces are tied to figures, moments, or emotional states that reflect different phases of his life and career. That kind of narrative depth creates connection, and connection drives demand. People aren't just buying a visual. They're buying a piece of a story they already feel invested in. And this is where things become even more intense behind the scenes. Because when narrative-driven art intersects with a globally recognized figure, it creates a form of demand that isn't purely financial. It's psychological. Collectors want to feel like they're part of something unfolding. They want to own a piece that represents a turning point, a transformation, a moment that will be looked back on later as significant. There are already quiet indications that some early buyers are framing their acquisitions in exactly that way. Not as purchases, but as positions. Positioning themselves at the beginning of a new chapter that hasn't fully revealed its potential yet. And while all of this is happening, the supply remains tightly controlled. Releases are limited, appearances are selective, and access is carefully managed. This isn't accidental. It's a strategy that aligns perfectly with how value is built in high-end collecting. You don't flood the market. You restrict it. You don't chase attention. You let attention build naturally around what's scarce. That approach is also being reinforced by the types of spaces he's choosing to engage with. Instead of mass market platforms, he's aligning with established galleries, curated exhibitions, and environments where credibility matters. That positioning sends a clear signal to serious buyers. This is being built within the system, not outside of it. And once something is accepted within that system, it becomes much harder to dismiss. Because at that point, it's not just about public opinion. It's about institutional recognition, collector behavior, and market dynamics all moving in the same direction. Another factor quietly strengthening this shift is the way his identity is evolving in public perception. For a long time, his image was tied almost entirely to his film roles. Iconic characters, unforgettable performances, and a style that made him instantly recognizable. But now, a second layer is forming. Artist. And that second layer isn't replacing the first. It's expanding it. Which means his audience isn't shrinking, it's diversifying. Film fans, art collectors, cultural observers, and investors are all intersecting in the same space. And when multiple audiences converge around a single figure, demand multiplies. There's also a timing element that can't be ignored. The global market has been shifting toward tangible assets that carry both cultural and financial weight. Art, collectibles, and rare items are being viewed differently than they were a decade ago. They're no longer just passion purchases. They're strategic assets. And when a figure like Johnny Depp enters that space with a controlled, narrative-driven approach, it aligns perfectly with that broader shift. Reports from Reuters have already highlighted how his initial releases generated significant revenue in a very short time frame, but what's more important isn't the numbers themselves. It's what those numbers represent. Proof of demand. And proof of demand is the foundation of everything in this world. Without it, nothing sustains. With it, everything accelerates. There are also subtle signs that future projects may expand beyond traditional formats. While nothing has been officially confirmed, the structure of his current releases suggests an understanding of how to build series, how to create continuity, and how to maintain engagement over time. That kind of thinking opens the door to long-term positioning rather than one-time success. And collectors are already thinking in those terms. They're not just asking what this is worth today. They're asking what this could represent in 5 years, 10 years, even longer. Because when a narrative becomes part of cultural history, the objects tied to the narrative often follow. This is why the competition is becoming more strategic. It's not just about acquiring pieces anymore. It's about acquiring the right pieces, from the right series, at the right moment. Timing, selection, and access are all being weighed carefully. And the more this mindset spreads, the more intense the environment becomes. Because once enough people believe something has long-term significance, they begin acting in ways that make the belief a reality. That's the feedback loop that drives high-value markets. Belief creates demand, demand creates scarcity, scarcity increases value, and increased value reinforces belief. And right now, that loop is quietly forming around everything he's doing. What makes this even more compelling is how controlled the narrative remains. There hasn't been an overwhelming media push. There hasn't been constant exposure. Instead, information is surfacing gradually, through verified reports, selective interviews, and observable behavior. That controlled flow keeps curiosity high while preventing oversaturation. And in a world where attention is often diluted by constant noise, that kind of restraint stands out. It also gives early observers a sense of discovery. They feel like they're seeing something before it becomes obvious. And that feeling is powerful. It motivates action. Because no one wants to be late to something that later becomes significant. And as this shift continues to unfold, the gap between public perception and private behavior is becoming more noticeable. On the surface, many still see an actor exploring a new interest. But beneath that surface, a different reality is taking shape. One where identity, scarcity, and narrative are combining into something far more strategic. And the longer that gap exists, the bigger the opportunity becomes for those who recognize it early. Because once the public narrative catches up, the early phase disappears. And when that happens, everything changes. And once everything changes, it doesn't reverse. That's the part most people underestimate. They think moments like this are temporary spikes, something that fades once attention shifts somewhere else. But in reality, when a new identity locks into place at the right level, it becomes permanent. And what's happening around Johnny Depp is moving closer to that point with every controlled release, every selective appearance, and every quiet confirmation from within the industry that this is no longer experimental. The conversations among collectors have already evolved beyond whether this is real. That question has been answered. Now the focus has shifted to positioning. Who got in early, who holds what pieces, and how future releases might be structured. Because in markets driven by scarcity, information becomes as valuable as the asset itself. There are already whispers of private viewings where access is restricted to a very small circle. Not public exhibitions, not open gallery events, but controlled environments where relationships matter more than visibility. This is where serious acquisitions often happen. Not in front of cameras, but behind closed doors where decisions are made based on long-term strategy rather than public hype. And that level of exclusivity changes everything. Because once access becomes limited to that degree, it creates a barrier that most people can't cross. And barriers create hierarchy. Those inside the circle gain advantages that those outside simply can't match. This is also where perception begins to solidify into reputation. Within those circles, Depp is no longer being discussed as someone transitioning. He's being discussed as someone already established within that space. And that shift in language matters more than it seems. Because reputation, once formed at that level, tends to spread outward over time. There have also been continued references and verified media coverage reinforcing this direction. Publications like BBC News and Reuters have not treated his involvement as a novelty. Instead, they've documented the measurable impact of his releases, the speed of sales, and the scale of demand. That kind of coverage adds a layer of legitimacy that casual attention simply can't provide. And legitimacy is what attracts a different class of buyer. Not fans, not casual observers, but individuals who move based on data, patterns, and long-term potential. When they see consistent demand supported by credible sources, they begin to treat it as a serious market. Another important factor is how his creative output is being paced. There's no rush, no attempt to maximize short-term profit by increasing supply. Instead, Everything suggests a deliberate approach. Fewer releases, more meaning, stronger narrative connections. This pacing keeps demand ahead of supply, which is exactly where value grows most efficiently. And it also prevents one of the biggest risks in this space: oversaturation. Once a creator floods the market, even strong demand can weaken. But by maintaining control and limiting output, he's avoiding it entirely. There's also an emotional dimension that continues to strengthen the connection between the work and its audience. Many of his pieces reflect personal themes, experiences, and influences that people recognize from his public journey. That familiarity creates a deeper level of engagement. Buyers don't feel disconnected from the work. They feel like they understand it. And when understanding turns into emotional attachment, value becomes more resilient. People are less likely to sell quickly, less likely to treat the pieces as temporary holdings. They become part of a personal collection rather than a transactional asset. This is why holding behavior has become such a strong signal. Early buyers aren't rushing to flip for short-term gain. They're waiting, watching, anticipating what comes next. And that patience reduces available supply even further. At the same time, new interest continues to build. Individuals who initially ignored this shift are starting to look closer. They're seeing the verified reports, the sold-out releases, the growing presence in established art spaces. And they're beginning to ask the same question that early collectors asked months ago: is it too late to enter? And the question alone tells you everything about how quickly perception is changing. Because once people start worrying about being late, behavior accelerates. Decisions become faster, competition becomes sharper, and opportunities become harder to access. There's also a broader cultural layer forming around this transition. It's not just about art, and it's not just about collecting. It's about reinvention. A globally recognized figure stepping away from one of the most visible industries in the world and building something new under entirely different rules. That kind of narrative resonates far beyond the art market. It becomes a reference point, a case study, something people talk about as an example of how identity can evolve. And when the narrative is tied to physical pieces that people can own, it creates a bridge between culture and asset. Something that exists both as a story and as an object. That dual nature is incredibly powerful, because it allows value to grow from multiple directions at once. Cultural significance increases attention, attention increases demand, demand increases value, and value reinforces cultural significance. And through all of this, one thing remains consistent: control. He controls when to release, how much to release, where to appear, and how to communicate. And in a world where most public figures are constantly reacting to external pressure, that level of control stands out. It also ensures that every move carries weight. Nothing feels random, nothing feels forced. Each step builds on the previous one, creating a sense of continuity that keeps people engaged without overwhelming them. There are also indications that this strategy is being carefully observed by others in the industry. Not just artists, but brands, investors, and cultural institutions. Because if this model continues to succeed, it could influence how future transitions are approached. Instead of chasing visibility, creators may start prioritizing scarcity. Instead of constant output, they may focus on curated releases. And instead of broad audiences, they may target specific, high-value segments. In many ways, what's happening here could become a blueprint. But for now, it remains something that only a limited number of people fully understand. The public narrative is still catching up. The broader audience is still focused on past roles, past achievements, and the possibility of a return to film. And while the conversation continues, the real movement is happening elsewhere. Quietly, strategically, and with increasing momentum. Because by the time the spotlight fully shifts, the foundation will already be built. And those who recognized it early will already be in position, while everyone else will be trying to understand how they missed it. And that realization, the moment people start asking how they missed it, is usually the exact point where entry becomes the hardest. Because by then, access isn't just limited by availability, it's limited by relationships, timing, and positioning that were established much earlier. And what's unfolding around Johnny Depp is moving closer to that stage with a level of precision that feels intentional rather than accidental. There's a noticeable shift happening in how future releases are being anticipated. It's no longer passive interest where people wait for announcements and then decide whether to engage. It's proactive behavior. Collectors are trying to get ahead of announcements, connecting with galleries, staying in contact with insiders, and positioning themselves for access before anything becomes public. That kind of behavior only emerges when confidence crosses a certain threshold. And confidence in this case is being built from multiple directions at once. Consistent sell-through rates, verified media coverage, controlled supply, and a narrative that continues to deepen with each new development. When all of those elements align, they create a level of momentum that's difficult to slow down. There are also growing indications that certain pieces from earlier releases are being treated differently than the rest. Not all works hold the same weight in the eyes of collectors. Some are seen as foundational, representing the earliest stage of this transition. Others are viewed as part of a developing series that may gain importance as the narrative expands. And the differentiation is starting to influence how acquisitions are being prioritized. In private discussions, early works are often described as anchor pieces. Not because of their immediate value, but because of what they represent in the broader timeline. Owning something from the beginning of a shift like this carries a different kind of significance. It's not just about the object itself, it's about its place in history. And history, especially when tied to a globally recognized figure, tends to amplify value over time. This is why holding behavior continues to dominate. People aren't just buying, they're curating. Building collections that reflect not only taste, but strategy. Selecting pieces that align with the long-term view rather than short-term movement. There's also a noticeable change in how galleries are positioning upcoming opportunities. Instead of broad announcements, there are more targeted communications, more selective invitations, and a greater emphasis on relationships. This approach filters access, ensuring that demand remains concentrated among those most likely to engage seriously. And that filtering process strengthens the entire ecosystem. Because when access is controlled, it reduces volatility. Pieces are less likely to circulate rapidly, prices are less likely to fluctuate unpredictably, and the overall market becomes more stable. Stability, combined with scarcity, is one of the most powerful combinations in any high-value space. At the same time, public awareness is slowly beginning to rise. More people are noticing the pattern, connecting the dots between verified reports from Reuters and BBC News, and recognizing that this isn't a short-term experiment. It's a structured evolution. And as that awareness spreads, it brings a new wave of attention. Not all of it converts into action immediately, but it increases pressure on the limited supply that already exists. Because every new observer is a potential future buyer. And when supply doesn't expand to meet that growing interest, the imbalance becomes more pronounced. There are also subtle signals suggesting that future expansions could introduce new formats or collaborations. While nothing is officially confirmed, the way his current work is being structured indicates an understanding of how to build continuity. Series that connect, themes that evolve, and releases that feel like chapters rather than isolated events. That kind of structure keeps engagement high over time. It gives collectors something to follow, something to anticipate, something to build around. And anticipation is a powerful driver. It keeps people involved even when no immediate release is happening. It maintains attention without requiring constant output. This is very different from the typical cycle of attention in entertainment, where visibility needs to be maintained through continuous activity. Here, absence can actually increase interest, as long as it's balanced with meaningful reappearances. And that balance is being managed carefully. There's also a growing recognition that this shift represents more than just a personal passion. It represents a repositioning into a space where value is defined differently. Not by box office numbers or streaming metrics, but by rarity, narrative, and collector behavior. And those metrics tend to operate on a different timeline. Slower in the beginning, but potentially much stronger over the long term. This is why the current phase is so important. It's the foundation. The period where perception is still forming, where access is still possible, and where positioning can still be established. Once that phase passes, everything becomes more structured, more competitive, and more difficult to enter. There are already early signs that this transition is approaching that point. Increased competition for access, stronger emphasis on relationships, and a growing gap between those inside the circle and those observing from the outside. And that gap tends to widen over time. Because as more people try to enter, the criteria for access often becomes stricter. Galleries prioritize existing clients, collectors prioritize long-term relationships, and opportunities become more selective. This creates a reinforcing cycle. Those who are already involved gain more opportunities, while those who are not face increasing barriers. And in that kind of environment, timing becomes one of the most valuable factors of all. Looking at everything together, the pattern is becoming clearer. A globally recognized figure shifts focus into a controlled, scarcity-driven space. Initial releases validate demand. Collectors begin to move early. Supply remains limited. Narrative continues to build, and awareness gradually spreads. Each of these steps builds on the previous one, creating momentum that becomes harder to ignore with time. And yet, despite all of this, the transition still feels understated from the outside. There hasn't been a single defining moment that forces everyone to pay attention at once. Instead, it's been a series of smaller signals that, when combined, form a much larger picture. And the kind of gradual emergence often creates the biggest shifts. Because by the time it becomes obvious, it's already well established. Right now, that process is still unfolding. The narrative is still expanding, the market is still adjusting, and the full scale of what this could become hasn't been completely realized yet. But the direction is clear. And the people who are closest to it, the ones watching every move, every release, every subtle change, they're not treating it as a possibility anymore. They're treating it as something that's already happening. Something that's already moving. Something that, once fully recognized, won't look the same again. If you've made it this far, you already see what most people are missing. This isn't about a comeback. It's about a complete shift happening right in front of everyone while almost no one is paying attention. And the real question is simple. Are you watching this early, or are you going to hear about it when it's already too late to matter? Drop your thoughts below, because this story is still unfolding and every move from Johnny Depp is adding another piece to the puzzle. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this, make sure you stay connected, because the next reveal might be even bigger.